Hello, dear students. Welcome back to my online math class. I am Teacher Ray, your teacher for today. Before we start, I want you to have your math textbook, your copybook, and pen. Today, I am going to discuss Lesson 6.1 Populations and Samples. This is in your textbook, pages 311 to 317. And here are the objectives of the lesson. Understand the difference between a population and a sample. Establish whether a sample is a representative of a population. And generate random samples that represent the entire population.
How can you use a sample to gather data about a large population? Think about this question during the lesson. The 2,468 registered voters in Morgan's town are voting on whether to build a new stadium. Morgan and her friends want the town to vote in favor of the stadium. How can they determine how the voters will vote before the day of the vote? How can you represent this problem situation using math? Morgan and her friends could ask every registered voter, or the entire population of voters in town, how they plan to vote. Is it reasonable for Morgan and her friends to survey every voter?
Select your answer.
Surveying thousands of people would take a very long time. Morgan and her friends would not be able to survey the entire population of voters. Morgan and her friends could ask a subset or a sample of the registered voters how they plan to vote. Surveying a sample of voters doesn't take as long and is more reasonable to do. Morgan and her friends would be able to ask 100 or 200 people. When you're choosing a sample, why is it important for you to define the population as clearly as possible? It is not usually possible to study every member of a population. But if you know information about the members of the population, you can define and generate a representative sample.
Use the slider to see different samples for this population.
The figure represents the entire population of 2,468 voters. Morgan and her friends could ask a small sample. It would not take very long to survey 20 people, though the sample may not provide reliable information about the population. Morgan and her friends could ask a convenient sample. It is easier to survey the most convenient people available, though the sample may not represent the views of the entire population. Morgan and her friends could sample a random subset of the registered voters in town. The sample is most likely to provide information about the entire population of voters. Now let's try it.
Miguel thinks the science teachers in his school give more homework than the math teachers. He is researching the number of hours middle school students in his school spend doing math and science homework each night. Morgan decides to survey a sample of the town's voting population. How can she know that the survey results from the sample of voters represent the position of the entire town's population?
A representative sample accurately reflects the characteristic of the entire population. In a random sample, each member of the population has an equal chance of being included. A random sample tends to be a representative sample. Now, let's click on each sample to see information about it. Let's subsample 1. Morgan can survey a random sample or a randomly selected group of voters to make sure her results represent the position of the entire town. Sample 2. Morgan could survey a convenient sample of the first voter she finds. These results are not random and are not likely to represent the position of the entire town. Let's subsample 3. Morgan could survey a randomly selected sample of voters. Because the size of the sample is very small, her results are less likely to represent the position of the entire town than sample 1. Now let's do another try it.
A produce manager is deciding whether there is customer demand for expanding the organic food section of her store. How could she obtain the information she needs? Morgan decides to survey a sample of the town's voting population. How can Morgan generate a random sample of the town's voting population?
Morgan can follow these steps. Step 1. Define the population. The population consists of the registered voters in the town. Step 2. Choose the sample size. Morgan plans to survey 100 registered voters. The larger the sample, the more confident Morgan can be that the results represent the position of the population. Step 3. Make or acquire a list of all members of the population. Step 4. Assign a number to each member of the population. Step 5. Generate a list of random numbers to select sample members. And now it's your turn. Try to do it.
Ravi is running against 2 other candidates for student council president. All of the 750 students in Ravi's school will vote for student council president. How can Ravi generate a representative sample that will help him determine whether he will win the election?
Morgan and Maddie will each generate a random sample of the 138 students in 7th grade at their school. They each write the numbers from 1 to 138 on small pieces of paper and put them in different hats. Next, they draw numbers randomly from their hats. Here are the numbers that Morgan drew. And here are the numbers that Maddie drew. What do you notice about the two random samples taken from the same population? What does this tell you about the sampling technique? Here are some observations of the samples. There are 20 members in each sample. The only common numbers to both samples are 38 and 106, and the numbers are distributed differently in each sample. The distribution of data can be shown by a histogram. A histogram is a graphical display of data that is grouped into ranges. What does the histogram show about Morgan's sample? The histogram shows an uneven distribution. Morgan shows more numbers between 81 and 100 than in any other range. He chose only one number in the range of 61 to 80 and in the range of 121 to 140. How do the histograms help you compare the two samples? The histograms show that the data is distributed unevenly but differently in each sample. Every range is represented with at least one value, and at most 6 values in a sample. We can conclude that the sampling method produces random samples that have mostly different members, but that are each likely to be representative of the population.
And now, let's have your try it.
The table at the right shows the random sample that Jeremy generated from the same population as Morgan's and Maddie's samples. Compare Jeremy's sample to Morgan's and Maddie's.
And we are done! Don't forget, answer items 1 to 18 in your textbook, pages 315 to 317. Please check your Pearson account for your assigned test. That's all for today. See you in the next lesson.